I think we're getting started, but I'm waiting for the magic message. Yes. Someone actually introduced me the other day to the phrase "good time zone, everyone." So good time zone, everyone. I'm hoping we know that some of you are not on the East Coast, but some of you are. So I am honored to be the host of this session today to talk about the progress that we've made in the fight against ransomware, particularly since the launch of the Ransomware Task Force report 5 years ago yesterday, and more recently, and more interestingly perhaps, the publication of Anja's book. So to kick things off this morning, I just wanted to say and begin with a note of gratitude. I'm really grateful that we've had the opportunity as a community to work on this issue together, particularly the time spent by the co-chairs, not all of whom are with us this morning today, but also for the members of the task force that came together 5 years ago and spent a number of hours together tirelessly thinking about and putting their, some of their interests aside to make the best recommendations that we could to try and raise the bar against this issue. I also want to say a debt of gratitude. I have a terrible echo, apparently. Do I? To the defenders who I think even before the task force have been on the front lines, really trying to keep our critical infrastructure and small businesses going. And as I was thinking about this event today, I was thinking that they are not still getting a rest. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of the role that AI is playing and will continue to play. And so I just wanted to say, extend my gratitude to the frontline defenders who are helping us every day. With that, I want to turn the floor over to Professor Shortland and say thank you again for writing this book and for giving us the opportunity to talk with you today about it. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Megan. Yes, I'm a professor at King's College London, and I specialize in extortive crime, and particularly that interesting and tricky space where legal entities have to make a deal with criminal organizations in a very low trust environment and hopefully not in a repeated game. So the question of who governs that space, who creates the norms, protocols, processes in that space, who enforces them, is really interesting. And I started with kidnap and piracy. I moved on to art recovery. And this is my latest in the unholy trinity of extortive crime on ransomware. And what I find so fascinating about this space is the people in it. And that's why I've written a book about the people in the space. And as Megan already said, the Ransomware Task Force was one of the real high points for me in this space. People really coming together to pool their resources, pool their knowledge, find what they can do together. And of course, this was launched 5 years ago at the most brilliant moment in the sense of focusing political uh, politicians getting ready to do something about it because of the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened the week after. And there we had a blueprint of 48 things that we could do to counter ransomware in a much better way. We're here 5 years later, and it's really interesting, I think, to take stock. It's really scary moment at this time with Claude Mythos coming in, possibly putting superior hacking capacities in the hands of people who did not have it before. So I want to look a little bit backwards, but I also want to look forward in this. So I've interviewed these people before, and it's really wonderful to be interviewing them again in this format. And my hope for this is that we're going to re-engage both politicians, but also businesses and their individual employees with the issue of ransomware again. One of the problems is that the average computer user tends to be the one that is the weak point of any business system, any government department, any healthcare operator, any university. So the hope for the book is that by really telling the stories, we engage normal people with this world, get them excited, and make them feel empowered to take part in the debate. So I think I want to start with Megan on this anniversary, this 5-year anniversary of the Ransomware Task Force. What has changed in the last 5 years, and perhaps what has not?
Thanks, Anja, and I regret that I did not introduce our fellow panelists this morning, so I'll leave it to them to introduce themselves, but they really actually need no introduction. So I would say that at the top line is to say, particularly I think for the United States and its close allies and partners, that ransomware does not present the grave national security risk that it did at the time that we launched the report. At the same time, that does not at all mean that we have solved the risk of ransomware. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And we'll talk a little bit about, I think, that some of that today. One can look at, for example, the fact that victims, particularly in the United States, according to Coveware, there are kind of fewer than 30% who are choosing to pay. And that decrease, unfortunately, though, means that the number of ransomware incidents has increased. So if you look at 2022 numbers, which are in the 3,000s, I think, to 2025 numbers, they're in the 8,000s. That is not a great trend. And one of the troubling things about that trend as well is the fact that many of the victims are on the smaller organizational size. So we talk sometimes, and I suspect we might get into this today, this idea of the organizations below the poverty line. Many cases, those are organizations that actually are the lifeline of our economy, and they're the ones who are now facing this threat. Once again, I would say. The other piece I would want to mention as well is this idea that the average payments continued to fluctuate, but we did see, I think it was 2 years ago now, the biggest payment, which we still don't know who the victim was, which was a $75 million, if I have my numbers right, payment. So the numbers continue to fluctuate, and I don't want to get ahead of our conversation. I think one of the things that keeps me up is kind of where we will find ourselves as AI continues to be adopted. But overall, I think the idea that we no longer have pipelines being shuttered and or meatpacking industries affected, those are good news stories. On the other hand, the idea that hospital systems continue to be some of the prime targets of ransomware actors is societally quite problematic and suggests that we cannot at all begin to rest on our laurels.
5 years ago, when we were talking, we really had a lot of issue about data. Has data quality improved? Are people now reporting it?
I think Michael, Daniel, and I should be specific about which Michael. This is something that I think he and I and many others have been harping about since the conversation started. My view personally is that we are still in a suboptimal information environment. We do have data, but if you compare what IC3, the Internet Crime Complaint Center that the FBI runs, reports versus what we see from the likes of Coveware, Chainalysis, others, the numbers, as I think Michael did one year, are like this. And so that to me suggests that we still have not reached the optimal point where we're getting consistent information that will then enable us to really advance some of the measures that we are continuing to try to put into place to drive down this risk. One of the challenges, right, we've made some progress. One of the early indicators on our side that we assessed there to be significant progress was the passage of legislation in the United States to require reporting of ransomware payments and ransomware incidents against a certain sector. Unfortunately, though, and we'll talk about this in a bit, I think that progress we assess to have stalled. Implementation of CIRCIA is the critical infrastructure. I always get this wrong. Cybersecurity information, no, CIRCIA. We all has the implementation of that has stalled. And I think Janet and Michael Phillips would definitely have views on other pieces of information and where other governments are coming in. But while we are seeing fewer victims make payments, it's not clear that we are seeing the victims actually report the incidents in the first place. And when we don't have information about incidents, we're not flying blind, but we certainly don't have a clear radar of what's out there.
And is there anything that we can see developing internationally in terms of best practice in this space?
I should probably turn it over to my fellow panelists here. I think one of the developments that we saw in particular in the international space was a statement by the Counter Ransomware Initiative now 2 years ago, I think it was, suggesting that critical infrastructure should not be, national critical infrastructure should not be paying ransoms. At the same time, and I, again, don't want to get ahead of the conversation, that issue was something that we as a task force could not reach consensus on. And there were a number of good reasons for that, I think. So I think, in my opinion, and I think we said this last year, 2 years ago, I'm losing track of time, 5 years goes by fast. We made a number of recommendations about putting us on a pathway to banning payments. And we assessed in 2024, I believe it was, that we were not to the point where we thought the ecosystem was prepared to manage a ban on payments. We continued, and I'm going to steal Jen's line, but she can chime in here then. We would, to ban payments outright would be to, which I'm jumping ahead from information to payments, but would be to begin a game of chicken with threat actors. I'll stop there.
Yeah. For the first time, the Ransom Task Force has noted backsliding. Would you like to comment on that? Where is the backsliding occurring and what's occasioned that?
Sure. We essentially went up to and down to. So we found ourselves when we assessed the status of the 48 recommendations to basically be in the same place. The two that we identified as losing progress, one of which I just mentioned is thinking about, well, CERCIA, I think, is the reporting requirements, and the slowdown there is not one that we moved, but I would add that. The two that we really highlighted as problematic are looking at the funding that we did see as a significant sign of progress in the US anyways, for something called the State and Local Cybersecurity Grant Program. While the program is authorized, it at this point has no money in it. And so for that reason, we reduced its status to preliminary action. The other was this idea, again, credit to Michael Daniel and the working group members that we had in the Respond working group, to establish a ransomware incident response network. While we had seen progress, particularly between the Department of Homeland Security and DG Connect in the 2024 timeframe, that process we assessed to have stalled. So that was the other regression. On the other hand, on the positive side, I feel like we need to be positive today a bit. We did move the status to significant progress around looking at creating target decks for ransomware actors. And one of the indicia that we factored in to make this adjustment was to take stock of the number of disruptions that the US and partner governments have been undertaking against a range of threat actors, not just ransomware, but particularly the ransomware space. The last one, and I will stop and turn it over to Michael Phillips maybe on this one, is the idea that establishing an insurance sector consortium to share ransomware loss data. CyberAccuView has been around since almost the week after, I think, it was around the same time as the task force launched its report. And so that it's our understanding from experts like Michael Phillips that there is some progress in that space.
Well, since you kind of invited me to
please.
jump in, when I think about the data challenges that we have 5 years on, I'm heartened by the fact that there is so much data around. So, just thinking about within the United States, the fact that there are 50 state data breach notification laws, each of which requires businesses that have suffered a breach of a certain size to report the incident to their attorney general's office. That's an instance in which the ransomware epidemic is getting captured in data that is available to government. But of course, you don't have to be a constitutional lawyer to appreciate that if there are 50 state agencies, each with a different law, each receiving a different set of information, that might not be transformed into actionable insight that our national security, our law enforcement, and indeed our defenders at scale in the private sector can operationalize. So there's real challenge there, and one that the insurance market is thinking about. So appreciate Megan calling out some of the initiatives there. Internationally, you do see some of the same things. So if you think about the GDPR and the reporting requirements that that a country's data authority may require, you get a mix of, yes, they're getting lots of reports every day, but no, are they turning that into insight? And the NIS2 initiative on the continent as well is starting to operationalize more reporting, and there's progress to be made there. But how does it all gel together into something that the good guys can use to defend victims from the bad guys? I think there's still so much more work to be done, which Megan's conclusion with backsliding makes sense. So. That's my sort of headline take. I see a twinkle in Jen's eye, so I'll just see if she's got anything to add.
Well, I wanted to turn to Jen at this point anyway. We heard from the BBC about the superpowers of Claude Mythos, and I was wondering what you were making of the Mythos moment, please.
Claude Mythos, it sounds like that weird neighbor that always wants to do magic tricks on you, whether you like it or not. Look, we could do a full webcast, even a webcast series on the topic of Mythos. So I'm going to condense a really, really complicated topic into a very minimal thing and say, I think the big question people have right now is it hype or is it not hype? And yes, I'm absolutely happy that we would do a session on this as a follow-up. I think it's both. The reality is, in terms of what Mythos represents as a sea change of where we're going, a sort of signaling, if you will, that is a genuine big deal, and people should really be paying attention to what it means and where we're heading. In terms of what it means right now, in this particular moment in time, as a defender, you do not need to worry that tomorrow you're going to be inundated with attacks and vulnerability reports, right? Like, that is not where we are. But it is more about where we're heading. It's that same moment that we had a couple of years ago now, where all of a sudden we woke up one day and ChatGPT existed in the world, and everyone was like, oh, except in this instance, we did see this coming. ChatGPT actually genuinely caught people quite by surprise, but we knew that AI discovered vulnerabilities was a thing that was going to happen. We knew that people were pushing the research to get there. This is the problem, is we actually know that the bad guys are going to do it. Now, in reality, do they need to be doing it super fast? No, because they're already making quite a lot of money. But as Megan mentioned, they're making perhaps less money than they were, or they're having to work a little bit harder to make that money. So in truth, if they can get to this point, it is a good thing for them, not for us, for them. I think the thing to remember is when you think about the vulnerability ecosystem and vulnerability discoveries, there are three sort of primary stakeholder roles. There's the discovery parts that traditionally has been researchers or users who stumble on something and then disclose it. So that's discovery. And in discovery, you sometimes also have things like verifying how it can be used, that kind of thing. Then there's the vendor piece. Like, I make technology, and when somebody comes and tells me that my baby is tragically a little bit uglier than I hoped it would be, I have to then go through a process of triage. So I have to figure out, is it a real thing? What are the implications of it? How dire is it? I then have to figure out how I'm going to prioritize it and how I'm going to allocate resources to mitigating it. This is the development of a patch. Now, in truth, all of that is really quite a heavy lift for a vendor, okay? And so even just the verification piece is heavy. So that's one of the things that Mythos does for you, is it does the verification piece. But then once I have it verified, I still have to apply resources. And I don't magic those resources up. They don't appear out of thin air. I don't rub a lamp and a genie appears. And I wish. Instead, I have to take those resources from something else, something that they're currently working on. And that thing then gets impacted. So the widget that my customers are desperately asking for is not going to be delivered by Christmas now, because instead I have to develop a patch. So that's it's a lift, right? It's a heavy lift. It's a commitment. Then the third role is obviously the end organization who then have to take that patch, if we're not talking about, for example, cloud environments, and they have to deploy that patch. And today, what we see, the reality pre-Mythos, was that one, vendors have a challenge in allocating resources to issuing patches. Like very few vendors are Microsoft. In fact, I believe there's one vendor that is Microsoft. There are other vendors other than Microsoft that are able and do apply resources, but it comes at cost, right? There is an implication of it. And so the vast majority of vendors, the long tail of non-massive vendors have a difficulty in applying those resources. The other thing that's reality today and was reality before Mythos is that companies, end user organizations, have a very hard time deploying patches. And there are lots of complicated reasons why that is true. And in some situations, it's literally like, if I deploy a patch, it's going to break everything and I can't have everything broken. This is even more true when you look at OT and ICS. And you know what kind of environments we use a lot of OT and ICS? Critical infrastructure. The things we all rely on every day. You know where you find a lot of OT? Ooh, hospitals, water treatment facilities, oil and gas. And so the problem that Mythos really presents us is that right now, we all have a bunch of technology that is entrenched, that we rely on every day. And that technology, I guarantee you, absolutely 100% has vulnerabilities in it. It has always had vulnerabilities in it. Humans create code. Code is complicated. There are things that happen. All technology has vulnerabilities. The problem is we are about to massively accelerate the rate of discovery of those vulnerabilities. So today, imagine that every day you go to a beach and you stand on the shore and the waves come up and they lap at your toes and you look out at the water, right? And one day, and you go every day, and some days the tide is high, and some days the tide is low, and you have to walk further down the beach to dip your toes in the water. But every day you stand, you look at the waves, the water laps at your toes. And then one day you stand on the beach, and you watch as a tsunami comes barreling towards you. Now, while it is true that you have always experienced the waves and the water, and your toes have always got wet, that does not mean that you were in any way prepared for the tsunami. That is where we are. We are not prepared for the tsunami, and we don't really have a solid plan of what that means. And this is why Mythos matters. It isn't that Mythos matters in terms of like what Anthropic is specifically doing with the specific companies that have signed up for Project Glasswing. That is great. And actually, I would just like to say, all power to Anthropic for doing it in a really responsible way, right? And all the people who are signed on to that. Why Glasswing matters, why Mythos matters, is because it is the tip of the spear. It is the first stage. It will only be a flood from here. And all the things that we've tried to build in recent years to get those end user organizations better at adopting patches, to get vendors better at deploying patches, all of that is about to get completely overwhelmed, and we have no plan for how to stop that. So things, for example, like the KEV catalog, the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, I like enjoy it while it lasts. And I'm sorry, that's a really bleak note to end on.
But that's why we're here. That's why we're here, because at the moment we can still sound the alarm, not being 5 foot underwater.
Yeah, exactly right.
So that was the plan, Michael.
If I could just sort of build on what Jen was saying, I mean, I think I completely agree that like you can have all sorts of debates about whether Mythos is actually something new or whether you could have done this with like Opus or Sonnet or whatever, beforehand. The larger point is that we know that these tools are going to make it much easier to find vulnerabilities, write exploits for them, and then go and exploit them, right? And so whether that's today or 6 months from now is almost kind of irrelevant. And for me, the big thing that Anthropic and Mythos has done is actually shined a light on it so that people are now paying attention to it and are talking about it. For me, some of the implications are that vulnerability information is now going to become a commodity. Previously, I think a lot of the industry treated vulns as like this artisanal like thing. Even though like last year there were 48,000 of them or whatever, but like we still were treating them as if they were these little research projects with this artisanal output. And that's no longer going to be viable because you're looking at like 10 to 100x, right? So in terms of the vulnerability output. So if that's the case, we know that there's a couple of other things too. All vulnerabilities are still not equal. We know from historical evidence that only about 5 to 6% of vulnerabilities were ever actually exploited. Now, AI might increase that percentage, but okay, so it doubles it. Great, we're now to 10%, right? You still have the problem of figuring out which of that flood of vulnerabilities actually are going to hit you. And so we also need to build much better triage systems because exactly what Jen said, like the effort is still going to be there. So you really only want to spend the effort on the vulnerabilities that actually matter. So we need to make sure that we're really focused on the vulnerabilities that are actually going to be exploited in the wild by the bad guys to do something malicious. And then the other thing we have to, someday we will be in a place where the number of vulnerabilities in your software actually tells you something about your coding practices and the quality of your software. We are not at that point today. As Jen said, everybody's software is going to have vulnerabilities. Everybody's in all this together. So far, everything that I've read says that every piece of software that anybody has turned an AI loose on, the AI has found vulnerabilities in it. Nobody is exempt from this. So I think we have to get away from this idea that like, oh, they've got vulnerabilities and so their software must be like, again, someday we will be there and I will happily live in that world. We're not in that world yet.
I do want to just pick up on something though. This idea of like not everything that Mythos finds is good quality is true. However, that's a weapon in and of itself. If you can flood a system with low quality disclosures, then basically you gum up the system and you create a signal to noise problem, right? And again, this is all about resource allocation. If you can't allocate resources efficiently to do patching, and you can't get past the initial triage stage because you're so buried under the flood, then that actually just wipes out your ability to respond. So there's a lot of talk at the moment of people being like, oh, but the bugs it's finding are really low value. And it's like a DDoS effectively, right? Like that's the kind of thing we're seeing here. The other thing I think is important about this, just going back to ransomware, is that to an extent, this is just an example of how AI is lowering the barriers to entry into the ransomware space, right? Like, yes, you can find vulnerabilities more easily if you're using something like Mythos, but actually that's just one way they're doing it. You know, they're also using AI to, for example, launch much more convincing and compelling phishing attacks, as an example. Like there's all sorts of things, like there's the speed of automation, the speed of discovery, there's all sorts of sort of things that they can do to apply it to the attack surface. And so I think the key here is about the fact that the barriers to entry, which were already pretty low, are getting even lower. And so what we're seeing is a lot more entrance into the ransomware marketplace. We're seeing again those specialisms appearing, but like actually people being able to do things outside of the specialisms because you can vibe code malware, right? Like that's the crazy thing now. And so I think that's the thing to bear in mind is like as we have the conversation about Mythos in the context of ransomware, is yes, there's a whole thing that's interesting about the discovery of vulnerabilities in and of itself, but there's also the fact that it is just symbolic of where the whole ransomware industry is going, which is leveraging AI to reduce those barriers to entry, to flood the market, and actually just to like further support the aims of nation states that provide these safe havens that are advancing their own political goals, which in the current climate of the political landscape we see is very relevant.
Yes, and very scary indeed. If you make the ransomware gangs more efficient at the extortion stage, if they can find out what the sensitive data are, if they can use AI to interrogate the company's financials to see where they should pitch the ransoms, you can contract these ransomware gangs that used to be maybe 100 people to maybe 3 or 5. What Will Line at the Metropolitan Police calls Frankenware is just sort of splintering and becoming ever more widespread. And of course, as you're saying, the political hacktivist who might not have had a chance beforehand and might want to be launching something more malicious can also find weapons-grade malware in the darknet. Michael Phillips, are we ready for this? Are businesses ready for this? Is insurance ready for this?
So when I think about being ready for this, insurance tends to think about it in a very specific way, but I promise I'll zoom out from that very specific way with my remarks. We think about capacity, and when we think about capacity in insurance, we're literally thinking about the actual financials that are available to pay claims to rebuild from the flood that Michael Daniel was just talking about. I think thinking about that, and I think the answer to that question is yes. But it's worth thinking about the broader sense of, are we all ready for this, and what might insurance be able to provide? And so then I think the answer, are we ready, is probably a bit of yes and no, especially in the face of the Mythos moment and the possibility that it does change the attacker economics, the correlation to exploitation, the volume of both vulnerabilities and exploitable vulnerabilities, as Michael and Jen were just talking about. When I think about larger enterprises, are they well positioned? Yes, but many of them would say that the insurance market isn't providing them enough capital. So there might be a protection gap there. But more importantly to me, I would call out for this audience and an area of real focus for us in the task force, what insurance people would call the SME tail, the small businesses, the community enterprises, the school districts, the hospitals, who are either not getting insurance or they're not getting other protection. So at the same time that the insurance market has matured enormously about ransomware in the 5 years since the Ransomware Task Force, one thing that I think we have been failing to do is really tell the human stories that persuade people that this risk matters, that they should be thinking about this risk. How do they manage it? I say, how do they pool their risk? How do they band together, whether to seek public policy mechanisms to protect them or insurance? And of course, that's where, Anja, where your book, Where Dark Screens, is so valuable, because it tells the human stories in a way that I think we've really struggled to in the insurance market, for instance. So I think it is a bit of yes and no. Are we ready for this? Certainly, I wouldn't worry about whether the insurance market is there to pay the claims when they come. But I don't know that we're all the way there when it comes to being ready for the next problem.
Yeah, I think insurance has been very cautious about how much they insure. If there are big claims with exclusions and limits, they insure what they're comfortable with. Unfortunately, that is only possibly a small part of the exposure that firms are getting, and in a way that's been good, because handing the risk back to the customer encourages them to operate more securely. Classic insurance problem. With Jen's tsunami that's coming, to me, one question that arises again: should governments be thinking about being back in this space with a reinsurance, like terrorism insurance, a fallback option, some resources to draw on?
Oh, well, I'll start, but I'd be keen
Yes,
to
please
hear
do.
from
Yes, you're still on the hook.
That's right. But I'd be keen to hear from everyone on this. I think it's worth distinguishing two questions when we think about a government backstop. The first is there a current market failure? And then the second is whether a federal backstop badly designed would distort the political economics of cyber risk management. And so all I'll say, just maybe to invite my colleagues to join in, is I really do think we are at the beginning of the question of the political economics, as I would understand it, of cyber risk. Who's responsible? If the business owner decides not to upgrade their end of life technological infrastructure, their old software, they don't patch it, their old hardware, they don't replace it, are they responsible? Do we blame them for the fact that the door is unlocked and there's the lights are on, and the valuable assets are visible to criminals. If we do not, what area for insurance, and then from there, what area for government to help rebuild or help firms recover. And so there's almost a moral dimension to that, I think. But the question of who is responsible ultimately for bearing the risk. I mean, that to me is the question of who underwrites. As an underwriting business person myself, I think about what role the insurance sector has in that. But ultimately, all risk is underwritten. It's just whether we're doing it smartly and in the right phase of the game. But I'd be curious what my colleagues think.
Megan, you want to come in?
I see Michael Daniel is off mute, so I will.
Oh, okay.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the question really is how I think Michael is right in the sense that it's really about how you would design such a system, because you have to imagine, like, what would you need that for? And so you have to hypothesize that what you're dealing with is some sort of systemic risk that could impact a whole bunch of customers and clients all simultaneously, such that the private market for insurance couldn't handle it. I mean, that's really what you're talking about. And it certainly is not impossible to come up with scenarios. I mean, we've been talking about these cyber scenarios for years, but I think they're even less likely than a lot of people thought. And so while I think that's potentially a useful idea to have down the road, I also think there's a lot of higher priority actions the government should be focused on in order to actually address the problem. For example, like exactly what Michael was talking about, like we still are struggling with this idea of the standards of care. Like, what is reasonable to expect a business to do such that if they don't do that, they should be liable for that part, versus what's not reasonable. And so, they shouldn't be liable for that part, right? We still haven't even figured that out. And so I think that would be a much more productive space for governments to really work on, that would have a dramatic impact on the level of cybersecurity that companies invest to.
I'm with Michael here. Both Michaels. Michael squared. Look, I don't know how to answer the question about reinsurance. I'll leave that to Michael Phillips as his specialist subject. It sure ain't mine. But I think there's plenty that governments can be doing here to help. And I think, that one of the things we've seen is a big focus on the role of vendors and, what they're doing to ensure that they're building security in. We've seen the EU lead on this. And, I look forward to seeing that get adopted more broadly. I think the next big question that needs to be tackled is what we do about legacy. And it's a really complicated, difficult problem. But in reality, if you think about like all the things that we're talking about at the moment, like, for example, secure by design, that's all great if you work on a premise that you start from scratch and you build something from scratch and people buy this, everybody buys it tomorrow and it's great. It doesn't do anything about the fact that, like, I have an engineering plant or a manufacturing plant that is reliant on a piece of machinery that I've had for 30 years and I don't want to replace it. And, I remember many years ago, Katie Mazouris at the time at Microsoft telling a story about them having a customer in the oil and gas industry that had a deep mining drill. I don't know the terminology. I'm sorry, I'm not au fait with the jargon of the sector. But they had this drill, and it was a drill that went really deep, and replacing it would cost, I think, like hundreds of millions, or even something beginning with a B for billions. And so every year they paid $1 million to Microsoft to support Windows NT. And at the point at which, like Katie was telling the story, Windows NT was already absurdly out, like long dead, long not supported. And it was worth it to them, $1 million a year to support a dead piece of software, because replacing the drill would cost so much more, and the drill relied on Windows. But the thing is, like, you might take that money in and be like, yes, we'll support it for you. But what does that really in effect mean? Like, it's a massively outdated technology. It's not at the rate of where we are with technology now. And when you add in AI as a factor to that, that's, even more scary. And so I think what we do about legacy has to be, and like these are not just the edge case examples. Like, yes, I'm giving extreme examples here, but the truth of the matter is we all know that hospitals are full of legacy technology. And actually, we all know that government is full of legacy technology. And to be honest with you, your average company is full of legacy technology. Maybe like not the computer on your desk, but like somewhere there's legacy technology that's causing a problem for you. So I think we really, really have to figure out what to do about that problem. And it's not an easy problem to fix. And the market is not going to fix it on its own. You know how I know? Because it hasn't. And I'm sitting here waiting. It's been a minute. So I think like there are plenty of areas where the government can intervene, and I would love to see them do so. And my vote is for legacy to be addressed.
Well, and we've seen ransomware addressing legacy at the British Library, where they decided that they were not going to rebuild their system. And thank you very much, but no thanks to the decryption key. We're just going to go back to the card catalogue. But yeah, that was an interesting lesson in legacy. Michael, Daniel, if you were advising in the White House today, what do you think should be the priorities for the government? What are your main concerns and recommendations?
Well, I think for the US government, in our context, I would say that the level of disinvestment in cybersecurity at the federal level is very dangerous. It's materially increasing our risk. We're not just not prioritizing cybersecurity, we're actually walking away from, at the federal level, a lot of missions. We're reducing funding, we're reducing staffing, and that's not good at this point. I don't see anything in the threat environment that warrants that level of retreat. The federal government has also been trying to push a lot of responsibilities and say, okay, states, you take it. But nobody told the states that they were going to have to take that up. And, you know, like many of them are not in a position to simply take on an additional burden like that, nor is it necessarily, economically efficient to be done at the state level. A lot of these problems are national security problems. They're national economic problems. And like, even to tie it back to what Jen was just saying, why do we care about legacy tech? I mean, if there was a factory machine in the 1950s that was old, the only thing that it affected was that company. It just made it less efficient. But now your risk is my risk, right? That's why we care. It's all of this risk is not just private risk anymore. There's public national risk to these things. Another thing I would say is that, if I'm talking to the US government, I would say get the CERCIA regulation out the door. I mean, it's been 4 years now. We're in danger of being lapped by the European Union. Like, seriously? They're working on like a NISA with the single reporting portal for the entire union, and they're going to do that in like a year. Okay, fine. So they end up with 18 months. We're still going to be like behind. So we really need that data to, inform the policy decisions, because we need to be making policy decisions based on empirical data rather than gut feeling and sort of, anecdotal evidence. And then I would say kind of the third thing is that it's great if we want to be on the offensive against the criminal networks. I actually support that, and want to be on the offensive against our adversaries. But that needs to be coupled with a whole broader strategy for how you raise resilience at the same time you're doing that. And that needs to be done in conjunction with our allies, because a lot of the blowback will affect not just us, but our allies as well. And so the only way to really make a dent in the criminal gangs and networks that are out there, for example, on the cybercrime side, is to really do this in coordination and collaboration with, all of our international partners, and even perhaps some of our frenemies out there. And that requires a lot of diplomatic engagement.
Indeed. One of the things that Megan mentioned as a real positive is that we haven't seen a repeat of the Colonial Pipeline attack. But I've been rather shocked by recent language coming out of the United States regarding what is acceptable behavior in international conflict. Do you think that that might change the way that hacktivists and ransomware actors perceive what is a legitimate target?
I mean, I think not surprisingly, the criminals have never really adhered to much of that. I mean, you've had some that have argued that they've shown some restraint, but they generally don't show much in the way of restraint. Where I think it's, potentially more destabilizing, right, is to the extent that we normalize conflict below sort of what has been traditionally thought of as the, armed conflict. That just makes the environment more dangerous, more unpredictable. It makes it difficult for businesses to plan. It makes it difficult for businesses to operate. And it's really not a sustainable environment over the long run for, achieving the kinds of things that we, want to achieve. For example, if you really think about at a certain point, if it gets too bad with the hospitals will make a decision. They will say, you know what, we can't take the risk to invest in new digital technology. We can't. It's too risky for us. And we will have to forego the benefits that those additional technologies could provide to our patients because the downside is too high. Do we really want to be at that spot as societies where we can't take advantage of the advantages of the digital ecosystem because the risks are too high? And so I think that's where I would say the sort of normalization of sort of low-level destruction and conflict is not a good thing because it creates too much uncertainty, too much risk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got about 10 minutes for audience questions, and some have been pre-submitted. And the first one was, do you see a role for the average individual in the effort to fight ransomware? And my answer is an emphatic yes, which is why I've written the book. That's why I want to engage people with their own cybersecurity. It's why I want them to have the language to engage with politicians on this dimension. Jen gave us a really interesting talk about what happens to the patch, but in the end, it's the user that says, am I going to update? Am I going to interrupt what I'm doing to run a stupid update that's going to slow my computer down? And yes, please do it. You need to understand, people need to understand why that is an absolutely outstanding idea. Password hygiene.
I think, if you think about the old days of security, Anja, like those of us who have been around for a really long time in it, which is probably several of us on the panel and plenty of people who are dialed in, we used to talk about defending the perimeter or protecting the perimeter, and then we used to say the perimeter is dead. The truth of the matter is that every individual user is a point on your perimeter. Mm-hmm. That is what your perimeter looks like now, and it's a scatter charge, right? And it often covers crosses borders, right? Crosses organizations, crosses job role and function. And so each of those individual people has a shared responsibility for security. And this is one of the challenges that security teams have inside organizations, is getting those people to care about that or recognize it. And, something as simple as somebody bringing in a toaster and plugging it in a staff kitchen and not recognizing that the toaster is helping itself to connecting to the internet is a problem, right? And like stupid stuff like that actually happens. You don't think it does. You think it's just a prank, like a punchline. But like the things that people do, people have this great idea of, we'll stand up a microsite for something. And it's all done out of good intent to achieve great goals for your organization. But if you're not talking to the people who run the technology in the organization, and more importantly, protect the technology in the organization, then you just it's like you literally brought your own pocket bulldozer to work and you just pushed a doorway into a wall, right? Like you have to think about those things. And I know that we can't expect everybody to have the level of sophistication I think even those of us who work in security like struggle with what the level of sophistication is that we should all have. And we don't make it easier for people when we give competing advice, right? Like when organizations tell you that you have to have passwords of this level of complexity and this length, and then another person is like, just use 3 different words, right? Like if we can't agree, it makes it much harder for people. But the reality is that I personally have always hated the term digital citizens, but that's what we are today. We are as virtual as we are physical. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true because we rely on virtual services in every part of our lives. And to just stick your fingers in your ears and go la 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 isn't okay anymore. It just isn't. And as a side thing, before I shut up, I'm just going to say the book is excellent. I'm not saying that because I'm on this webcast. The book is excellent. What Anja has done, as Michael said, is she has written the history of ransomware through stories, through individual people, and it's so engaging and it's so accessible. And so if you listening know somebody who is like super not engaged in this topic, doesn't know anything about it, doesn't care, it's a great entryway book because it's just stories about people, about their aspirations and their foibles and their weirdnesses and their vulnerability. And it is, and like, it's lovely for me as a security person to use the word vulnerability as it's actually intended to be used, not talking about a technical bug. It is a great read, and so I just like, this is my quick sales ad here for you, is Dark Screens. It's a great book. You should check it out.
Thank you so much. The other set of questions that I've seen are on the ransom ban. The idea that many people came into the Ransomware Task Force with originally, let's criminalize ransom payments, let's remove the profit motive from this landscape. And in the end, you decided that the world was not ready for this. The question is back in the room. Michael, are we ready? Are we nearly ready? Should we start to get tough on people paying ransoms?
I mean, I will say the answer is no. We have not done the homework, right? And Jen and I actually are on opposite sides of the fence about whether or not we should ultimately do this, I think. But we agree on the fact that, like, everybody thinks like a ransomware payment ban is like the Staples easy button. And it's like the thing you do at the end, like, when you've like done all the other stuff and you're finally ready to like really put the screws to the bad guys. Like it's the last thing you should be doing because there's all this other stuff you need to do to get ready for that. And like we're going into the complete opposite direction in the US, like the reducing the resources at the government level that are available to help companies deal with an incident. Like we're actually going backwards. And so I think that there's just a lot more homework that needs to be done. And I think you can even see, like, even with the stats that Megan was talking about at the beginning, like we are decreasing the number of companies paying ransomware without putting in place a ban. And in my ideal world, you would get that number so low that then when you put in place a ban, like all you're doing is taking care of the last little set of people who just didn't quite get the memo, right? And we're sort of actively avoiding dealing with it, right? And so that those are the only people you're affecting really with a ban on the good guy side. And so that is my view of the current situation. So we still have not made enough progress to really start to implement those. Now, if you're talking about like, prohibiting government entities using taxpayer money to pay ransoms, that's a different story because that's a very different thing in my view of having taxpayer money going in that direction. But that's very different than like a, countrywide sort of economy-wide ban.
Yeah, so we're still at cruising altitude. We're not on the glide path yet.
Not yet.
What a shame. Oh yes, there are two different books, one for the US and one for the UK. So they're two different titles. My publishers could not agree, unfortunately. So
Did they make you change all the like C's to S's or
Yes, you've
like
got it
reverse the
perfectly
E to the
spelled for
R?
the American market. But I don't know about the I don't know about the reader, whether you just get an English woman reading it. I don't know whether there's an American version of that, but we'll see. 1 minute, one last question. Anything that's really surprised you about ransomware in the last 5 years?
Well, at risk of, I mean, I will actually say that it surprised me that the problem hasn't gotten any worse than it has, to be honest. And that it's been interesting to me that the criminal enterprises have shifted to as much sort of cyber-enabled scams and fraud as they have continued to use what we think of as ransomware. And I think there's some interesting analysis that could be done over why is that shown, why has that shift sort of happened, and what are the market dynamics, what are the incentives for the adversaries that are driving that. And so if anything, I've been kind of surprised that the problem hasn't gotten worse than it is.
Yeah, I have a similar thing. After Colonial and HSE and JBS happened, um, there was a really weird moment for those of us who've worked in security for a long time, which is that the president of the United States was on the nighttime news talking about ransomware. He said the word ransomware. It was super weird for me. I was like, that's a record scratch in my brain. And then in the following period, he spoke to Putin a number of times. And he made this statement of like attacks against US critical infrastructure need to stop or else. And there was a sort of hanging or else, right? And I have to say, like, for me, I was a little bit like, well, it's a bit of an opaque statement, and really, what does it mean? And we had this like weird period of run up from like May 7th through to February so May 7th, 21 through to February 22 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And like at that point, everything went really quiet and all bets were off. And then we saw like the split of different groups and we saw the Conti leaks and et cetera, et cetera. And there was a feeling that like attackers were either being put to other uses, or there was a lot of like uncertainty around what might happen with NATO getting involved. And so like everything went quiet for a while. And then when the activity started to flood back in the following year, and it did flood back in, right? Like it went up crazy quick. What was interesting was the attack had changed its nature in the US in particular. And no longer was it focused purely on disruption-based attacks, which it had been before. And now it had shifted to exfiltration-based attacks, so data theft and data extortion, which is a really big difference from a national security point of view. One is a thing governments care about and will act on, the other is not, to be honest, to put it in very, very blunt terms. And so that to me suggests that actually the thing we've theorized for a really long time, which is this connection between the safe haven governments and the organized crime groups sitting within them, is a real thing, that there really are parameters that are set to help advance political goals, but also that there are boundary lines drawn. You cannot do a thing that is going to trigger a kinetic response. And the fact that we saw that switch, like so in the UK, where we have not had that conversation in that same way, we're still seeing disruption-based attacks here. We're also seeing exfiltration for sure, but we haven't seen the seismic shift in nature of attacks that they have seen in the US. So that to me says that, and like genuinely, you can knock me down with a feather over this, that suggests to me that the president of the United States telling the president of Russia, cut this out or else, worked. And that is fascinating to me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I hope we're going to hear more from the Ransomware Task Force. and Claude Mythos. I hope we will have that however many hours it takes of webinars. As always, it's been brilliant meeting you. Thank you so much for all the interactions I've had with you, and especially for today.
Thank you, Anja, and thank you, Michael, and Jen, for the conversation. Yes,
I'll change my name to Michael to make it easier next time.
M3.
Me too.
Like the car. So yes, we're not going away at all. So we're looking forward to continuing the conversation on the current state of ransomware and where Mythos and other advances, what pathway they put us on, and how we can better collaborate to limit the concerns, limit the negatives. Thank you again, and congratulations on the book.
Yeah, and happy 5th